It was many years ago while I was discussing something with a friend on his Facebook wall that somebody showed up and was also getting involved in the discussion. And it was about society, everything was wrong with it, and so on. And that person increasingly made the point that it was time to basically get rid of the whole system, overthrow everything, start a revolution, and begin again from scratch. Now, I disagree with that for a variety of reasons. One of the points I made is that, well, these kinds of revolutions cost a lot of lives, typically. So, what would be the number of lives lost that you will find acceptable to get your revolution? Meaning, how many people do you think, well, this is reasonable, that X amount of people die, but if it's more than that, that's maybe a little bit too much. And he refused to answer. And I argued some more. I said, look, you are calling for the death of people because that is inherent in the kind of revolutions that you're talking about. And for some reason, you decided that you have the authority and the power to call for that, despite what other people think of this. And he danced, he beat around about the bush a little bit longer, refused to answer. I said, look, okay, you decide this for yourself, that's one thing. But you have no control over who those people will be, the ones who lose their lives in your glorious revolution. So that might be your wife, your children, your friends, your loved ones, your parents, could be any of those. Do they also get a say in how far this revolution goes and what, and to begin with, if one should be started? Or have you decided for them? He refused to answer. That was many, many years ago. And it was one of my exposures to this kind of radicalized thinking that I have seen basically all over the place, especially in these last few years in social media. It's been very, very prevalent. And you really have to be living under a rock to not notice that there's a very big increase in polarization in Western society. Now, that is the main reason I started the research for this episode. And at the same time, it was something that was asked by somebody online when I asked for topics for the podcast, is if I could do something about radicalization and de-radicalization, including self-radicalization. So I did a lot of research, I made loads of notes and recorded this episode actually several times because I was never really happy with the result. What you're listening to right now is as good as I can make it, and I hope that's enough for everybody listening. So let's get right to it. Again, I'm going to get political. I'm going to say some things you might not enjoy hearing, and I would like to ask you to hear me out, because if something triggers you into an emotional response, we're getting precisely to the heart of the matter when it comes to radicalization and so on. So, as I just mentioned, there's a lot of polarization in society nowadays, and in large part it is political. Now, it's 2024, it's September 2024 when I'm recording this, so we've got the United States elections going on. Right now it's Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris, and let's just say that opinions are extremely polarized when it comes to both candidates. Now, I don't vote in the US, I'm a Belgian citizen, so I have no say in the matter at all. My opinion is irrelevant in that regard. I will talk about both of them in a minute throughout the podcast. So let's just do this thought experiment first. And then I can hopefully convince you to keep on listening without getting too upset first. Now, as I just said, I live in Belgium. I'm a Belgian citizen. I was born here, raised here, lived here all my life. I was fortunate to travel a lot throughout the world, but this is my country, it's my home country, and I still live here. If you are, let's say, a staunch Republican and Kamala Harris says that I live in Belgium, can you admit that she's telling the truth? Same thing, if you are a never Trumper or if you are a staunch Democrat and Donald Trump says that I live in Belgium, can you admit that he is telling the truth? How about Vladimir Putin? He goes out and says Wim Demeere lives in Belgium. Can you admit that he's telling the truth? If the answer to that is no, then you are radicalized. Then you are, for whatever reason, ideologically captured. You're so wrapped up in your own ideology that you cannot accept reality as it is. And that will lead to cognitive dissonance. Why? Well, because you have to deny reality as it is, knowing full well that you're doing that. Because I just told you, and there's ample proof of me being a Belgian citizen. But it's coming from somebody that you either politically or on any other level completely disagree with, or you might even loathe or hate that person. And because of that, you cannot admit and accept that they just told the truth about something that you know is true. So the end result of that cognitive dissonance is that you will increasingly be confronted with your own ideology being incorrect. And increasingly you're going to have to more and more twist your own mind in all sorts of ways to stick to your ideology. That eventually leads to a lot of suffering and a lot of problems for you. And at the same time, it's going to keep you further away from whatever goal you have. It will make it more difficult for you to reach the goal of whatever ideology or political party or what have you that you want to promote. And the end result will be that you fail and that you will suffer tremendously because of that. Why? Because if you consciously fool yourself into denying reality that you know is true, that is a principle. You've accepted it in principle that you can do that, which means that now we're no longer arguing about the principle, we're just arguing about how far you will use it, how far will it go, how far will it extend, when is too far, you don't know, because you accepted it as a principle. The old joke of supposedly Winston Churchill said this comment to some woman that he found rude, if I'm remembering correctly, where he called her basically a prostitute or something along those lines, and he said that, we've already established what you are, now we're only arguing about price. And it's something along these lines, is that once you've accepted for yourself that you can deny reality consciously, not subconsciously, but consciously deny that this is happening, that somebody you hate maybe is telling the truth, then you're entering into the goals justify the means to an end. And that tends to backfire tremendously in many, many ways, because you cannot deny reality forever. I've been saying for a while now, in many different contexts, that reality is a wall upon which ideology breaks itself. You can believe in an ideology very strongly, but reality will not be denied, the laws of physics will not be denied, and so on. So that's a little bit of a backstory here. So if something that I said here triggers you, I apologize. It's not my goal to trigger anybody into any negative stuff, but I'm making a point here. I'm trying to explain something, and this is the way that I have to do it. Now, let's go back to these questions. If Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, or Vladimir Putin said that I am Belgian, that I live here, and you can actually accept that as a truth, then we've established that also as a principle. We've established that even a person you might despise is capable of saying something true. Now we can argue or discuss how far you're willing to believe them. That is a much healthier principle, as opposed to saying, just because it's that person, whatever he says, it's not true. So I hope you can see the difference here. Now, you can see this as two sides of the same coin. And that's basically what I want you to, if you have an interest in figuring out if you're radicalized or not. If you can figure this out, this kind of stuff, and hopefully get to the conclusion that, well, maybe I am, but there's a way out of here, or I don't think I am, because I actually apply this, everybody wins here. So the thing that you most of all need to be able to do is to be able to say that the other side, the opposing side, is not necessarily evil or wrong or immoral because they disagree with you. That's the flip side of that coin. If you can accept that they tell the truth about something, well, then they're not necessarily evil because you're in agreement. This is true. You're both in agreement that this vile person said something true about me. All right, well, they can't be evil because you agree that I live in Belgium, and Putin agrees that I live in Belgium, so that doesn't make him evil for accepting something and saying something that is fundamentally correct. And that's a good starting point. Now, I'll end this introduction with a quote from Paul Graham, who recently said, "The test of an ideologue is whether they think someone could disagree with them and still be a good person." And I think that's a very, very important aspect of everything that I want to talk about today, is to keep that in mind. Is that you have to be able to disagree with somebody and not necessarily view them as a bad person. That's common ground. We can work with that. So that's it as an introduction. Just let's dig in. So radicalization, self-radicalization, what can you do about it? I'll give you guys some tools at the end that I think are important. Bear in mind, I claim no scientific authority. I'm no psychiatrist, psychologist, or anything. I'm just giving you my opinion from personal experience and also from the research that I did. So first things first, we all have biases and all of us can become radicalized for a variety of reasons. Deradicalization is basically an antidote to a polarized society, and it starts with yourself. That's the main goal of this episode, is that, okay, it starts with you. Don't begin with other people, begin with yourself. Now, both these terms, radicalization and de-radicalization, are difficult to define. It's better actually to not see them as something singular, but more as a process and not just like an end state. Because we still don't know everything about it. There's still a lot we don't know. Despite that, I believe it's important to try to give definitions so that we're all talking about the same thing. So let's call radicalization a complex process that involves an individual or a group adopting increasingly extreme political, social, or religious ideals and aspirations and goals. I think that's a reasonably neutral definition, and this is the one that I'll work with for today. Now, what is important is that it's typically only a small percentage of radicalized people who actually carry out, for instance, violent attacks. And therefore, understanding and preventing radicalization, it's a potential way to reduce these kind of violent attacks. So, for instance, the value of following the law, being a law-abiding citizen, is a factor that actually protects you the most from becoming radicalized. And I'll talk some more about that later. Now, what is also important to keep in mind is that every individual's path towards radicalization is going to vary greatly. It's going to vary a lot based on your personal, your social, and your environmental factors, which will be different for everybody. So as a result of that, it's important to really approach this topic with a more nuanced understanding, not black and white, but looking at individuals. Despite that, I'll give you some common factors that in the literature we tend to find as warning signs. So this is the first part. So I'll give you mostly seven warning signs to look out for. First one is group identification. Now, this is basically, a psychological state where an individual is going to adhere and commit to a group, and that becomes more important than their own individual identity. We see this a lot in cults, for instance. So this is like a very deep sense of alignment with that group, and that eventually over time can lead to adopting very extreme beliefs that are common in this group, and behaviors and actions. A good example of that is Antifa. They have something that they call direct action, which tends to be violence. Now, you might not start there, but if you, for whatever reason, identify increasingly with them and start committing to that group, you can get very, very radicalized. Second warning sign, changes in behavior. So that's sudden changes in behavior and attitude or appearance. That could be, for instance, people withdrawing from family and loved ones and friends, or showing a very strong interest all of a sudden in political issues, religious issues, societal issues, and so on. So it's mostly the sudden change that is the key factor here. Third one is obsession. That means that you're very intensely preoccupied with a specific idea or topic that is going on. Now, when that is related to a specific ideology or a belief system, that can lead to radicalization. For example, you might become very much obsessed with a political cause or a religious doctrine, and that then leads you to increasingly, again, gradually become more extreme in your views and potentially engage in then very harmful behavior in support of that obsession. Another big factor is prison. Spending time in prison can be a very significant predictor of radicalization. Why? Well, because they can be a breeding ground for it due to various factors, just as you're being recruited by the other prisoners because you don't have a choice to survive there. You have to go to a certain group, and then you start supporting these extreme groups from within prison. And then obviously there's also a very hostile environment there, and that can make the feelings that you have of anger and resentment and so on over your punishment, over your prison sentence, can make those even bigger, which makes you again more vulnerable to being radicalized. Then we have the fifth one, threat, bullying, and discrimination. So if you experience being threatened, bullied, and dehumanized and discriminated against, that can obviously lead to feeling marginalized, and as if you're insignificant, your life doesn't mean anything, which in turn increases the risk of being radicalized. For example, immigrants who feel marginalized and discriminated against in the host countries where they live, because these expect them to integrate into the new society and the culture, and if that doesn't happen easily, or that often ends up being more difficult than what a lot of people think it might be, that can lead to friction with the local population, and then you can get racism, discrimination, and so on. And as a result, this then leaves them very angry because of the experience that they have. Sixth one is negative attitude and anger. If you're just generally speaking, a very negative person, a very angry person, that can very easily lead to radicalization. For instance, somebody who's very angry because of certain social injustices that they see in society, they can be a lot more susceptible to radical ideologies, because these will validate their anger. They will add fuel to that fire, actually, and also offer them a target for those frustrations. So if you have this negative attitude of, everybody's against me, or I can't do anything right, and so on, then you are basically the ideal target audience for a lot of very extreme groups and ideologies, because they love to have maladjusted people amongst them, because they're easier to convert into a radical extremist. Last factor, seventh factor, is job loss and criminal history. So if you suddenly get fired from a job, or you lose your job for whatever reason, or you do have a criminal history, well, that is, in and of itself, a very important factor of potential radicalization. Because once again, these kind of situations can lead to feeling resentment, and that in turn again makes the individual more susceptible to those radical ideologies, because they will then give you a sense of purpose and belonging that you don't get once you're an outcast in society, because of all of a sudden you're out of a job. So, people look at you, you might think, as some sort of loser. You went to you went to prison, you find it difficult to find a job, and so on. You carry that stigma with you. Yeah, you can feel resentment against society very easily that way. So everything that I just said is not a definitive list. And it's also not a list that you take to check boxes and say, aha, okay, so the person checks 5 out of the 7 boxes, he's radicalized. It's not how it works. Because sometimes certain factors may be a lot more present than others, and may be sufficient to end up being why one person gets radicalized. So once again, I want you to bear in mind that it's the individual's path to radicalization that matters, and what makes it so difficult to predict, because usually the path is very complex. For instance, after we had many years ago the Paris terrorist attacks that were done by ISIS in Bataclan in Paris, where it was a massacre, the Brussels airport attacks, which was very close to where I live, the people that got arrested for that, a lot of research was done, and in the time afterwards, what they found, for instance, is that it was often third generation immigrants who became radicalized by this kind of ISIS extremely radical terrorist rhetoric and ideology. And they often got radicalized in the space of a very short amount of time, sometimes even talking days as opposed to weeks or months, which was what most people thought. That it was a matter of days of getting access to a certain kind of information, often via social media, often via the internet, and then consuming lots of it. And that was basically a catalyzing event that made them take action. So once again, as I mentioned before, don't look at the factors that I listed just a minute ago as being some boxes that you need to check. It's not how it works. It's a lot more complex than that. So now that we've looked at how you can get radicalized, let's look at de-radicalization. So before I get into that, just a little sidebar. A lot of the stuff I mentioned ended up being, it sounds like ISIS and terrorism and so on. Well, it doesn't have to be that. It can be Black Lives Matter, which ended up, and people get upset when I say that, and I'm like, I'm sorry you get upset about that, but reality again is what happened is that during the Black Lives Matters protests, a lot of them escalated into massive violence, looting, pillaging, murders. It all happened. And those caused billions and billions worth of damage throughout the Western world, not just in the US. In Europe, same thing. Now, you might think that's justified. I'm not going to discuss that. But then we get to what I said in the beginning. Once you are radicalized, it's very easy to think violence is justified. Now, this has nothing to do with a terrorist group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. It has nothing to do with that, but it's very damaging. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of businesses went bankrupt, and then the answer a lot of people give then is that, well, they've got insurance. Insurance doesn't cover everything. That's not how it works. So that's one example. Now we have, the latest flare-up in the Israeli-Palestine conflict has been going on for almost a year now. So a lot of people are protesting for free Palestine and so on. Some of the folks involved don't have an issue very loudly and publicly yelling for the death of either the Palestinians or the Israelis. I think it's fair to say that that's a very radical position. Whether you agree or disagree is irrelevant. My point is, it's a radical position. So everything that I said here above applies just as much to these conflicts or the Ukraine-Russia war or whatever soccer club that you are a fan of and that you hate the other guys who are your rivals and that you want to fight those supporters. Doesn't matter. Radicalized is radicalized. So that's sidebar done. Deradicalization. Again, these terms are hard to define. So again, once again, you want to see this as a process and not as an end state. There are just as well as with radicalization, here there are also many factors involved. Let's look a little bit at some of those factors. So when it comes to radicalization, again, deradicalization, there are no guarantees. So the best case scenario is that the person stops engaging in radical activities. So if you can remove the extremist thoughts and convictions, that would be great, but it's very, very likely impossible, fully removing them. Long-term de-radicalization counts, not short-term, meaning that they still might have some of those thoughts, but they're not following up on them anymore. It's no longer as extreme as it used to be. But if you want guarantees, then there are none out there. That's just not how human beings work. Now, a critical factor seems to be that the people start to have doubts, and the person can get disillusioned in the cause that they are very much radicalized into. It could be by the actions of the leadership or the people that he trusted when he discovers that the world isn't black and white like they presented to him, even within the own group, even with the individuals in the group. Now, they may have started out with a very naive or romanticized idea of what their actions would be like and what they can achieve. But then reality sets in. Like I said, it's the wall upon which ideology breaks itself. And then these people become disillusioned. So in this regard, there are what we call push and pull factors. So I'll give you some push factors. That's being disillusioned with leadership or with the strategy and tactics that are used. Disillusioned with the ideology of the group because it doesn't deliver as promised. Interpersonal conflicts within the group or with the leadership. The psychological cost of violence, which is sometimes very, very high. You might think it's easy to engage in violence, but it tends to leave a mark, and some people, unknown to themselves, have a very hard time afterwards with it. They didn't think they would, but then by the time it happens, it's too late. Another push factor is the stress of living a double life or a hidden life, meaning that you have to hide a lot of your activities, and that is stressful in and of itself. There's also pull factors, and this could be economic circumstances. For instance, you lost your job, but then you find a well-paying job or some other kind of opportunity. Education, you get access to education and information that opens up perspectives, whether it's economic or societal or otherwise. You could be drawn into another ideology or a different group. Could be religion, could be a cause, could be whatever other group that is, seems to be more in line with how you feel and so on. And that can be the path towards de-radicalization. Could be a relationship. You meet someone, you get married, you got kids, or you want to have kids, which is a very, very different goal from changing society. Or it could be that you meet moderate people and you start talking with them, hanging out with them, and you didn't think it was possible, but you, over time, form this positive relationship with them. And a good example of that is that there's a man, I'm forgetting his name, but if you look at it on the internet, you'll find him. He's a black man, he's a musician, and he is credited as being the one who de-radicalized the most KKK members just by talking with them. And just saying, like, look, I just want to know, I'm a black guy, you're a white guy, you hate me for being black. Why is that? Because you never met me. And he starts talking, and they end up, basically giving him their white hood and clothes and leaving that group. So that's an example of when you meet other people that are moderate, that you can actually have a good relationship with, something positive, and then end up de-radicalizing yourself basically through that contact. Now, once again, none of the above factors is definitive. There's no scientific consensus at this time that I can find. And regarding all these factors, how they work, how they interact with each other, and what the best course of action is. I'm going to close this chapter by saying that we're all at risk here. So everybody can eventually be radicalized one way or another. Very easy to do that. But there are things that we can do to prevent it. And as expected, this is also a very complex task. And you need a multifaceted approach. It's not just one thing. And that goes for radicalization in others, but also for yourself. Now, a lot of what I will list should be done, by the government or at the local political level, something along those lines. But by knowing the elements that are needed, you can be a positive force in this regard, as opposed to just somebody who gets swept along in that wave of radicalization. Before I start, again, none of this means that you have to be holier than the Pope. You can still be a regular human being making mistakes like anybody else. And as a good friend of mine who unfortunately passed away used to say, you don't have to hate your enemy to destroy them. So you can still be very much engaged towards a certain goal and be an activist. You just don't want to be a radicalized one. That's the difference. So what can we do when it comes to prevention and counter narratives? Well, online, social media, but also mainstream media, what often happens is that you see who likes what you wrote or what somebody wrote in the comments or on social media. You start following these people online, start interacting with them. Eventually that can lead to meeting offline, and all of a sudden you might not have realized it, but then you're in touch with an extremist in the real world. And obviously they're not going to show you their true colors in the beginning, but this is an easy path towards radicalization. So you want to be very careful when it comes to what you do online and who you interact with, especially in the real world. The second point is understanding that extremists will piggyback on conflicts. They always do, they always have. Now, and it's especially true when these are mainstream news. Again, Black Lives Matter, Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine, American elections, and so on. Whatever the issue is, if there's activism involved, then you will find extremists that will try to hijack that kind of, that topic basically. That because they thrive in chaos and they try to use whatever they can to further their own goals, which may have nothing to do with that BLM or Israel-Palestine conflict. They just want power. And they're going to use you, and the term is useful idiots, and look up useful idiots if you don't know what it means. They use you as a useful idiot to further their own goals while you think they are helping you achieve yours. The warning signs I have talked about when it comes to prevention. So people isolating themselves from their family and friends, spending most of their time online or with those other radicalized people and so on. Like in the family, withdrawing from your brother, your sister, your parents, and so on. That is something, when you notice it within yourself, that should be a typical warning sign. Because you notice that, okay, when you start thinking that they don't get it, your parents, they just don't get it, all right, that's a red flag for you. This one's a little bit tricky. The next one is promoting inclusive societies. What you want, ideally speaking, and again, ideally and maybe hypothetically speaking, but I think ideally speaking, you want to create an environment where everyone feels valued and included. And I'm not talking about DEI nonsense. I'm just talking in a regular way. If everybody feels included, then you can prevent the feelings of marginalization that can lead to radicalization. This needs to be done at government level. Now, the way it is done, that is what I think has been, an epic failure in Western countries for the last few decades at a minimum. The question also becomes, how do you do that? What is a better way? I don't think there are good answers. I don't think there's a guarantee that you can have an inclusive society with just whatever different kind of cultures that you're mixing together and want to blend into a cohesive whole. I don't know if that's possible, but that's a discussion for maybe another podcast. But let's just say that that would be very helpful if everybody becomes more aligned within society as opposed to remaining separate factions. A big one is counter narratives, and that's developing and promoting narratives that are going to counteract these extremist ideologies, and it can help challenge them and then change beliefs that lead to personal harm, violence, and what have you. This is one of the reasons why I often say that, let's say, if you hate Trump, you don't want him to win, or you hate Kamala Harris and you don't want her to win, cursing out the people who do follow that person and want to vote for that presidential candidate, just shouting at them and cursing at them, it's not going to help anything. The only thing you do is instant gratification. You're getting a dopamine hit because, yeah, you sure told that person what you thought of them. The only thing you get is more radicalization. They become hardened in their opinion of, oh, for sure, Trump or Harris shouldn't win because you see, these are the kind of people that would get into power talking about you because you called them whatever you called them. That's not a counter narrative. And then you can go look into propaganda techniques, lots of books about that, persuasion techniques, lots of books about that as well, finding better ways. That, again, this would derail the whole podcast, so I'm not going to talk about that now. But you want to have information out there that clearly counters whatever they believe. Another one is that you want to support people who are actually victimized by bullies, crime, or what have you. You want to have support for them so that they don't become bitter and hateful towards whoever bullied or hurt them. And this is a big one. These are the kind of people who might not necessarily themselves take action, but who might end up being very supportive of people who take action in a radicalized way. So you don't want to leave victims unattended to. You don't want to just, use them for 15 minutes to get the present you want and then just leave them by the roadside to just basically starve and fend for themselves. Because that's how you get radicalized people. We could go on. There's other ones. You want to address radicalization in prisons. You want people to engage in the community instead of being isolated within it. You want mental health support. All these kind of things are important to have at a societal level. So whenever you have a party or a movement, a political party or an activist movement that goes against these kind of things, it's not going to help, in my opinion. I very much think that it's going to be very counter-effective, actually. It's going to get the opposite result. You have to keep in mind, once again, that there's no one-size-fits-all, because you cannot just do one thing and then hope that it's going to prevent all radicalization. It's just not how it works. And these strategies that I just mentioned should also be tailored to the specific needs of each individual community, state, city, region, country, what have you, because they're all different. And as you know, I like to say the differences are as important as the similarities. Now, all of that said, how do you avoid self-radicalization? I'm going to give you a bunch of tools that hopefully you find useful. I find them useful. None of them are easy to apply. That's not how this stuff works. You're going to have to do a lot of work continuously. That's not, I did the work once and now I'm done. No, that's not going to happen. You're going to have to do a lot of work all the time. I believe it's worth it. But again, that's a different topic. Now, how do you avoid self-radicalization? Well, you start from fundamental principles first, or what is called first principles, meaning the textbook definition is a basic proposition or assumption that cannot be deduced from any other proposition or assumption. That means that they don't change even if circumstances change. They're like a compass to you, like a true north. This is your guidelines that you follow. You need to have some. Here are some that I find useful. Let's start with the first one. You can't know everything. There will always be vastly more that you don't know than what you actually do know. Many years ago, over 10 years ago, I wrote an article that still is, gets a lot of visitors. It's called A Cure for Arrogance in Martial Arts, and I'll share the link in the show notes, in which I talk about how can you avoid becoming arrogant as a martial artist or a self-defense practitioner. And in one of the arguments that I make is about this person who wrote this really short webpage where he talks what it means to get a PhD. And he starts with a big circle. And that big circle is all the possible knowledge that the world currently has on anything that you can think of. You are smack in the middle of that circle, so you don't have a lot. Then you go to school, you go to high school and so on, and then your circle expands. But it's also starting from that middle where you know nothing, and you very slowly expand a little bit more. Then you're off to college and you're going to get your PhD. As you go off to college and work on your PhD, you're actually narrowing down your learning towards something very, very specific. And normally your PhD should be about something that hasn't been done before. Meaning, if you look at the big circle of all the knowledge of mankind, you're at the boundary of that knowledge, and your PhD means you push it a little bit further. You push that boundary just a touch further. That's what a PhD means. Now, when you look at the graphic that is included with that explanation, you'll see that there is immensely more knowledge that you know nothing about. You have no information about that. And this is something that I often talk about as a warning. It's called ultra-crepidarianism, which is basically meaning that you are an expert, but you talk about subjects that are outside your area of expertise, as if you are an expert there as well. For instance, being a doctor doesn't mean you are an expert physical therapist. Just like being a physical therapist doesn't mean you could talk about everything that a doctor can. Being an architect doesn't mean that you can confidently talk about everything that is involved with being a martial artist or an MMA fighter. You know nothing about that unless you have experience and training in that. So that's something that I think is extremely important, is to understand that you can't know everything. You have to accept that. It's impossible to know everything. So you don't want to pretend, and you don't want to fall into that trap of, well, I just read an article or a headline in a newspaper, so now I know what I'm talking about. It's just not how it works. And then if you insist on doing that anyway, again, you will very quickly end up being proven wrong. Reality will prove you wrong. And then we're back to what I explained at the beginning of the cognitive dissonance, that you're going to have to fight your own brain to accept something you know is wrong because of your ideology, because you were radicalized, and that ends in tears. So you can't know everything. Another fundamental truth I believe is accurate is that human beings are inherently complex and flawed. I'll give you a list of things. We delude ourselves. For instance, for the men listening to this, it's okay to have another drink. For maybe the ladies listening to this, it's okay to have another piece of chocolate. Or for the younger listening to this, it's okay to binge on another episode of that Netflix show when I should actually go to bed because I gotta get up early tomorrow and go to work. So we delude ourselves into doing things that we know we shouldn't do. It's very common human behavior. We are also both emotional and rational, but we think we always act rationally, where we don't. I'll give you, again, a link into the show notes, a list of fallacies, of faulty reasoning. It's a very, very long list of very common ways in which the way we think is just completely wrong. For instance, a false dilemma or false dichotomy, which is very, very common when it comes to radicalized people. They give two statements, and these are given as the only possible options when in reality there's a lot more. For instance, you're either for us or against us. I can actually think that you're both assholes and want nothing to do with either one of you. There don't have to be two positions only. There are multiple options. You don't have to agree with somebody. Another false dilemma is, well, if you disagree with what I just said, you must agree with what my opposition said. No, you can both be wrong. So, and the list is extremely long. So just go over it and you will be amazed at how much of these fallacies that you recognize when people you oppose in their ideology or political views, you use them. The trick is then to look at, well, do I do that too? That's where the real work begins, because you will be sad to notice that you do as well. Another one, we are hardwired to be drawn in by stories. There's a reason why politicians talk about, for instance, their youth. Kamala Harris talks about how she used to take the bus and so on. It's a beautiful story. We're typically drawn in by that. Whether it's Joe Biden, Donald Trump, don't care who it is. Politicians often like to tell stories because we as human beings are basically hardwired to think in story structure. There's different kinds of story structure, but we think in story structure. That is why, for instance, commercials often tell a story, because you will be drawn into whatever they want to sell you by following that story. Human beings have been telling stories for millennia, whether it just by oral tradition, talking about some of the great epic tales from ancient times, whether it is in writing, whether it is nowadays in movies, TV shows. It used to be radio shows and so on, books, ebooks and so on. Stories are how we think, how we react. So if somebody is telling you a horrible story, for instance, they show you a lot of the death and destruction that is happening in Palestine right now, and I'm not saying it's not horrible, but they turn it into a story, and that story can then end up leading you towards radicalized beliefs. Could be the other way around. It could be something that the Palestinians did towards Israelis, and you get to see that, and then you get told a story to, again, lead you towards another radical belief. I don't care which one it is. I'm talking about the techniques that are used to radicalize people. So whenever somebody tells you a story, they want you to feel an emotion. As soon as you feel an emotion, you are no longer thinking rationally. You're being led by your emotions, and that's the path to radicalism. Next one. There is something called pensée unique, and this is a French term, and it basically means that you believe for typically a problem in society, a societal issue, that there is one solution, like this is it. For instance, renewable energy, that's all we need. If we have renewable energy, we're going to save the planet and we're done. That's it, that's all we need. Anything else, don't care. Pick another topic. I'll pick another hot button topic. Immigration in the US. Build the wall. If we build the wall, that's it, we're done. A lot of people think that. It would be completely wrong. It's not how it works. But that's pensée unique. As soon as you get ideologically captured, once you get radicalized, you often start thinking in these single factor solutions. Like there's only one factor we need to control, and when we do that, then we can get the utopian solution that your radical ideology presents you with. Problem is that reality doesn't work that way. Almost always there are multiple factors influencing each other, and just addressing one of them doesn't fix the issue permanently. At best, it's going to be temporary. At worst, it makes everything worse. So be mindful of pensée unique. Next one, we are social animals. We need interaction with other people, and we want to belong to a group, even if it's only a very small one. Could be 2 or 3 people. But that is what also makes us vulnerable to indoctrination, is that the vast majority of the people are social. They want to be part of a larger whole. They want to be more than just by themselves. There are exceptions, but on the whole, on average, human beings are social. Understand that if you are feeling lonely, you're feeling isolated, that it's very easy to be tricked into becoming a member of this group that later on turns out to be very radical. And again, the process is gradual usually. They don't start with the extreme stuff. You are step by step, progressively, gradually brought to accept extreme positions. So be careful when you are in such a situation that you, for instance, you're having a dark episode. You could be just getting divorced, lost your job, somebody passed away in your family, whatever, something very horrible happened, and you're in a lot of pain. You might be angry, and then you become radicalized because you're open to suggestion by this group or these people that you interact with, that you end up finding because you're looking for some sort of comfort, and then going towards other people, because we're social animals, isn't a very instinctive thing to do. Why this is important is that, well, on average, every human being has about 3 traumatic events in their life, on average, especially in the West. So that means it's gonna happen. It's just a matter of when, and that's when you're most vulnerable. If you know that up front, maybe you can avoid it. 2 more. Life is constant change. Accept it, embrace it. And the same is true of society. But most of all, science. Science is a process. When somebody says trust the science, or this is what the science says, or the consensus in science, I disagree. There is no consensus in science. There's the current state of what science in a specific field says, but it's not like this is a consensus and we're done talking. It's not how it works. So I'll give you, again, another thought experiment to illustrate that life is constant change on this planet. Do you think climate change is an issue or not? If you answer yes, all right, what's the issue? Because in the 70s, it was global cooling. There was the fear was that there was going to be an ice age. Then in the 90s, it was global warming. Now, it's 2024, for a few years now, it's been climate change. Where did the global cooling go? Where did the ice age go? Where did the global warming go? It went away. Now it's climate change. So I don't care what your answer is. It doesn't matter what I think, it doesn't matter what you think. What is important is to see that science is a process. It's not just an end state. And the consensus is not the answer to any scientific question. Scientific method just doesn't work that way. And if you want to learn more about that, I would suggest looking up the scientific method to get a better understanding of how it works. I'll leave you with a final first principle that I think is important. And this one comes from Thomas Sowell, that I actually heard from somebody else years ago. And he said, there are no solutions, only compromises. This is the biggest lie radicalized groups will tell you, is that this is a solution. There's no solution. There's compromises. There's always a win and a loss in the column. There is no ideal solution, because life on this planet is complex. Issues are complex. They're not black and white. And the end result is that if you get something, most likely you will have to pay for it in one way or another. So if you think of compromises as being the way forward, as opposed to black and white solutions, you can actually get more done. Because if the only thing you offer is your solution, which is take it or leave it, then the other side doesn't have a reason to compromise with you, because you have no willingness to compromise with them. So why would they? And then you only have conflict. So it's looking for win-win situations is in many ways the the best solution to avoid radicalization in yourself and ending up in conflicts with other people. I don't say it's always possible. I also don't say it's easy. I do say that it is vastly better than only thinking of a particular solution to be the absolute best thing to solve whatever issue you're being an activist for, and then running into a brick wall of opposition on the other side and ending with conflict. So what else can you do? So I just talked about a lot of fundamental first principles. What else can you do to avoid becoming de-radicalized? Well, look for outliers, look for opposing opinions. I am fortunate in that I am naturally drawn to the mavericks of the world, the outliers. I find those people vastly more interesting often than the consensus people. I'm not saying that the consensus people are wrong, but I believe there's truth to the matter of that much of the progress that we see in whatever the field is often done by people who are going their own way. They're going away from the beaten path. They are a little bit different than everybody else. They think different, they act different, they have a different idea. There's a lot of very deluded people doing that as well. I'm not saying this is a perfect solution. I am saying that it's a good thing to look into opposing opinions. And even if you dismiss them each time, use them to evaluate your own position. Don't just listen to your own side, but listen to the other side as well, and do so honestly. Don't just use it to claim, well, I'm open-minded because I listen to the other guys. No, actually do it as a way to learn and not just casually dismiss the opposing views by then claiming, yeah, I listened to them, where in reality you didn't. And this flows into the next part, which is something that I learned with now a good friend of mine, is that the value of the discussion is in the exchange, not in winning or converting the other party to your side. And this is with my friend Jerry, we, some 20, almost 30 years ago, I guess, we were in an email list that we were on, and we discussed, for weeks and weeks and weeks, and maybe months on end, we discussed a specific topic, and I got quite heated. He didn't. He was very calm, and eventually the moderators told us to stop. It's like, okay, guys, take it off the list because we're tired of you guys arguing. And he said, okay, this is great. The value of the discussion is in the exchange, not in the winning. Not in me proving you wrong or you proving me wrong. And, was my face red? Because I was in the discussion for the wrong reasons, and that was a big turning point for me to understand that I still enjoy a good discussion. I'm not just going to give in easily. I will defend my position, but then afterwards I have to be able to walk away, and you have to be able to still see that other person as a person, instead of just somebody being evil or whatever else you might want to think of them, simply because they don't agree with you. So looking for the exchange, even if it means that by having your own opinions tested and your arguments tested, that you get better at defending them, or that you fine-tune them where you notice that they are weak and actually you need to alter the way you think about something, which can help you achieve your goal. Because if in the discussion it turns out that what you proposed was not a good argument, it was not realistic, or it was just something that wasn't true, well, yeah, if one person can expose that, somebody else can too. So shore up your arguments, make better arguments, and then everybody wins again. And it's upon the other party to do the same thing. If you drop a bad argument in favor of a better one, and if they can't defend against that with their arguments, well, okay, that's their problem. Next one, and this is so hard, learn to admit you are wrong. You want to welcome it as a chance to improve your opinions and knowledge. And for instance, think of a belief that you once held that turned out to be wrong. How that process went from resisting at first, but eventually accepting the new information. Now, you might feel like the new belief was always there, and it's obviously true, but two things about that. So first, why do you think that is carved in stone, that new belief? why would it be impossible that in the future you change your mind again if you receive new information? Because you just did. Second point, now think of everything else that you are certain about right now. Why would the same not apply here? Why couldn't new information change your point of view? There's a French saying, and I like a lot, il n'y a que les imbéciles qui changent pas la vie. That means that only idiots don't change their mind. And this is what I believe it's all about. If you're in discussion and you're proven wrong, if your reaction is to ignore it or start cursing at that other person and so on, and then just huff and puff and go away, it's a very human reaction, but it's also a radicalized one. You're just going to have to eat the pain, suck it up, and adjust your position. Again, not doing that is the road to ruin, as I said, because that's cognitive dissonance. You're proven wrong. You know you were wrong, but you can't admit to it. And that is, once again, going to create cognitive dissonance, which creates a lot of problems. I'll sign off with something that I found very insightful from an economist that I've been following for a while, Lynn Alden, who also used to practice martial arts, and I find very insightful. And she posted this a while ago, and it was just a bullet point list of how she basically views things and what her process is like. First one, kill your ego. Second, kill your ideology, but not your goal. Third, build a new framework, but an open and a flexible one. And then finally, ask questions and deal with people you agree with and disagree with. Approach disagreement as a way to learn. She closes off with saying that hardly anybody does this in any discipline. And I think this encapsulates very well everything that I try to say today. As the Mandalorian says, this is the way. And I think that's a really good place to end it. My goal with this episode was not to convince anybody of anything. It was, like I said, in part inspired by these polarized times, but it was also a direct question from when I asked some people to give me feedback for different topics to discuss on the podcast, that I wanted to do this one here. I hope you find it useful. If not for you, maybe for somebody else. And this is despite a lot of people thinking that I'm all gloom and doom, which I am not, but I understand why they think that. This is one of the very few things that I like to think of, is that, well, that's going to be a really small contribution that I make to hopefully get away from these radicalized times. If it only helps one person de-radicalize, that would be awesome. If it doesn't do anything at all right now, but it does so in a year or 2 years, whatever, that would be even better. There's a funny proverb over here where I live, and it's alle kleine beetjes helpen, zei de mug en ze plaste in de zee. Which is Dutch for saying, all little things help, said the mosquito, and she peed in the sea. And I'll leave you with that expression. So if we can all do our little mosquito pee in the sea of chaos and polarization, maybe at the end of it, it's going to be this big stinking puddle of piss. And this is going to come back to haunt me, I'm sure. But I can't help it that, Dutch sayings here in Belgium, that's the way they go. So that's it as always, everybody. Thanks for listening. Feel free to share this with anybody you think might find it useful. Like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. Leave a comment if you have ideas. Most of all, if you want to support the work, become a patron. First week is free if you sign up as a green belt, and there is over 6 years of content in there. It's a huge, humongous library of information, whether it's a bunch of instructional videos from me, but also many of the bonus podcast episodes in which my guests that I interview answer your questions. So I think that's one of the most valuable aspects of my Patreon. Right, it is, everybody. Take care.